Information Systems and Cybersecurity 375. Today we're going to talk about doing layout with CSS. Ask you to bear with me. We've had some audio problems. Hopefully they're resolved by now, but if not, hopefully we'll take care of those soon, so bear with us. This annoying taskbar at the bottom I mentioned last time, I've been told they can't do anything about that, so we're just going to have to deal with it. I'm sorry. Last time we talked about how to use CSS for presentation style. For example, setting the color and the font of the text. But one of the best uses of CSS is to do layout, to position elements on the page. And we talked last time a little bit about why HTML isn't a good way to do that. We said that tables aren't great for layout, they're too rigid and inflexible, and we need something better. And using CSS, we're actually going to be able to lay out parts of the page with a lot of control. We're going to have so much control over where things go that it's going to work really well. So, to understand layout, you first have to understand something called the CSS box model. And this is an image of the CSS box model. Notice that we have the content in the center, and around the content we have some padding. So, the padding typically is the same background color as the content, and it's the space around the content. Around the padding we have a border, and around the border we have a margin. So the box model is applied to all block displayed elements on the web page. If an element is displayed in the block format, it can have padding, a border, and a margin. So it's important to understand which elements these rules apply to. So properties like the margin and the padding only apply to block elements. Now by default, paragraph tags and div tags are block elements. But tags like the A tag, the link tag, or the B tag, the bold tag, those do not create block level elements. They create what are called inline elements. And there are a lot of differences between block elements and inline elements. For example, if I create a block element, the block element expands to fill the entire width of the container. Now, the container is sometimes the entire page, but I might have a div inside a div or a paragraph inside a div, in which case, if my div isn't the full width of the page, the paragraph would expand to fill the div. So, typically block elements expand to fill the entire size of the container. They're usually also displayed with space around them. So, that means that they're displayed on the next line from the previous element. And they are displayed on the previous line from subsequent elements. And block style elements can be styled to have dimensional properties like a width and a height and a margin. Inline elements, on the other hand, don't expand to fill the width of the container. Instead, the web browser will size them to just fit the content. So if I have a link and the text of the link is home, then the link element will only be big enough for the letters HOME. It's not going to expand and have a bunch of empty space that goes all the way to the end of the page. They're also usually displayed side by side with each other with no extra space around them. And you can't apply dimensional properties to an inline element. It turns out that CSS also allows us to create elements that have a third property. They can be displayed as inline block elements. Inline block elements behave like inline elements. That is, they stack on the same line from left to right. But we were allowed to apply dimensional properties to them. So we can specify a width and a height, or a minimum width, or a minimum height, or put a margin around it, just like we could with an inline element. So it turns out that we can change whether an element is displayed as a block element, an inline element, or an inline block element using CSS. So for example, I can take a link. In this case, I'm going to take a link with the ID block link, and I can change it so that instead of being displayed inline, it's displayed as a block element. So notice again the selector here is a hash block link. By joining them together like this, I'm combining them, so that this rule will only apply to A tags that also have ID attributes set to hash block link. If I had a space in between the A and the hash, it would have a different meaning, but I can combine them in this way to only apply the rule, the display block rule, to tags, link tags, with that particular ID. I'm also going to apply a style change to elements that have the class attribute set to inline paragraph. Remember, I can use the dot symbol to indicate that I want to apply a rule to an entire class of elements. So in this case, I'm going to set paragraphs, for instance, with the class set to inline paragraph so that they display as inline block elements. What does that look like? Well, here's a web page I've created that has 3 links on it. The first 2 links are normal links. They're displayed inline. So they say, this is a normal link, this is a normal link. Notice that they just stack from left to right. It just keeps going on the same line. There's no wrapping. They just fit right into the paragraph. But I also have a block link. I have in my HTML code the words, this is a block link. But because the block link is set to display block, it is separated visually from the text, this is a, and placed on the next line. If I were to give it a background color or something, you would see that it actually spans the entire page too. So if I were to highlight it, maybe I can do that. The background color would start on the B in block link and go all the way across the page over here. Below that, I have 2 paragraphs. Each sentence is a separate paragraph with P and /P tags. So the first paragraph has the sentence, this paragraph is displayed as inline block, and the second paragraph has the sentence, notice that the second paragraph lines up with it. And indeed, you should notice that. Because I had changed them from being displayed block to being displayed as inline block, the paragraphs are actually displayed on the same line. They are now displayed in line with each other. However, because they're inline block, I can set a width or a height, or give them a margin or padding or a border. So let's talk about what that means. So one of the CSS properties that you can manipulate is the margin. The margin is a usually invisible space around each element that visually separates it from nearby elements. So there's actually 2 ways to set a margin. You can set all 4 margins at once, the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. Or you could use the margin-left, margin-right, margin-top, and margin-bottom properties to set individual margins. So, for example, I have a rule here that sets the margin for H1 elements to be 200 pixels. And since I only specified 1 dimension, that's going to set the top margin to 200 pixels, and the bottom margin to 200 pixels, and the left margin to 200 pixels, and the right margin to 200 pixels. All 4 margins will be set to 200 pixels. So this H1 tag, this header, is going to have a lot of space around it. The next rule sets the style for H2 elements. Those, remember, are slightly smaller headers of less importance. And in this case, I specified 2 dimensions to the margin property. The first dimension is 200 pixels, the second dimension is 100 pixels. When you specify 2 dimensions to the margin property, the first one is applied to the top and bottom margins, while the second dimension is applied to the left and right margins. So in this case, the top margin and the bottom margin will both be 200 pixels. The left margin and the right margin will both be 100 pixels. My third rule has 3 dimensions, and it's applied to H3 tags, and it says that the top margin will be 200 pixels, the left and right margins will be 100 pixels, but the bottom margin will be 5 inches. Notice that I can use different dimensions here for the margin. I'm not limited to just pixels. I can use pixels, or inches, or percent of the container, percent of the width or height of the container. I can use lots of units that we talked about last lecture. So here's what that would look like. The blue box on the top is an H1 tag. I've set its background color property so that you can more easily distinguish it from the others. Notice that it has a 200 pixel margin all the way around. All 4 margins are set to 200 pixels. 200 pixels from the top, it's 200 pixels from the bottom of its container, it's 200 pixels from the left, and 200 pixels from the right. The green box in the middle is an H2 tag, and you'll remember I set the top and bottom margin to 200 pixels and the left and right margin to 100 pixels. So if you look closely, you'll see that the left and right margins are actually smaller. There's more space separating the H2 tag from the top and bottom than there is from the left and right sides of the screen. The third tag, the black box, is an H3 tag, and you'll notice it has a 200 pixel top margin. The left and right margin are also 100 pixels. You can see that because they line up with the green box. But the bottom margin is actually much bigger. It's 5 inches. It actually may not be 5 inches on your screen because I had to zoom way out to make it fit on the slide. But proportionally, it's about 5 inches on the real page. I actually had to do some tweaking to get this to display properly because of something called the margin collapse problem. Now, the margin collapse problem we call a problem, but it's actually part of the way CSS is designed. By default, if you have two elements next to each other and they share a margin, CSS will actually combine the margins together. So if the margins overlap, they get crunched together. This has some advantages in terms of how layout works, but it can be really annoying and difficult to solve. Sometimes you just want to have both margins. Another problem with margins is that if you have if you have an element inside another element, maybe I have a paragraph inside a div. We call the paragraph the child and the div the parent, because the paragraph is inside the div. If the child has a margin, then that margin will be applied to its parent. So for example, suppose I have a div that contains maybe 3 paragraphs. That first paragraph, if it has a top margin, won't be separated from the top of the div. It'll be separated from the top of whatever the div is in, which is kind of annoying. In other words, the margin sort of gets promoted to the containing element. So there's a couple different ways to fix this. The way I fixed it here, if you look very closely, you'll notice that there's tiny white lines between the boxes. And the reason for that is that what I've done is put HR tags in. I put a horizontal rule tag in. So one solution to this problem is to add an additional element inside the parent div so that it isn't allowed to steal your margin. Basically, you put something in between the two tags so that the margins are physically separated. You can actually put an empty element in, like a div with nothing inside it, and make sure that it's displayed so that the margin goes between the empty element and the container. Another solution to this is to add 1 pixel of padding. For the most part, you're not going to run into this margin collapse problem. It's important that you're aware of it because sometimes if things aren't laying out the way that you expect them to, it might be that you have a margin collapse problem. And if you Google margin collapse, you'll come up with about a dozen other solutions to this problem, and one of them may suit you better than these two here. So we talked about the margin. Another feature of the CSS box model is that you can provide a border around an element. The border is a usually colored box drawn around an element, and it goes between the margin and the padding. So by default, there is no border. I guess there is a border, but it's invisible and it has width 0, so it doesn't show up on the page. You can give an element a border by setting the border color and style and size properties. So for example, I have a rule here that sets any element with ID box to have a border that is 10 pixels wide, is a solid style border, and is teal in color. If you'd rather, you can set the border top property and just have a top border, or the border bottom property and just have a bottom border, or border left and border right. You could set all 4 and have maybe a dashed border on top and a solid border on the sides and no border at all on the bottom. It's up to you. So this rule here will put a border around an element 10 pixels wide with solid lines that's teal in color. That looks like this. Notice that because in this case I have a div, and the div is a block style element, that the border spans the page, right? The div expands to fill the width of the container. It expands to fill the page. So even though I don't have enough text to go all the way across the page, the border does. If I were to change the display style of this div so that it were inline block instead of block, then the border would only go around the text. So there would be a nice line right after the X, and it would be much smaller, a much smaller box. So margin to border. A third feature of the box model is padding. Padding is a usually invisible space around an element. One thing I should say about that, the padding is usually invisible, but it takes on the background color of the content. So if you set the background color to, say, gray or blue, the padding will have a blue background too. That's not necessarily true of the margin. You can set the padding with the padding property. It behaves like margin. If you specify 1 dimension, it's used for all 4 sides. If you specify 2, it's used for top and bottom, and the second dimension for left and right, and so forth. So in this case, I have a rule that says any image in my document should have 20 pixels of padding all the way around. So here's a picture of my son at soccer. And if you look very closely, you'll notice that there's a small gap around the picture. And that gap is the padding. It's a 20 pixels of padding. It's kind of hard to tell that there's 20 pixels of padding on the right because it blends into the background of the div that the image is in. But if you look at the text that says Rick on the soccer field at the bottom, I know that's hard to read, you'll notice that there's a little gap between the image and the text, and that's caused by those 20 pixels of padding. So, if we put that all together, we might do something like this. In the left column, I have an HTML file. And it has all the tags we talked about last week. We've got the doc tag at the top, then the HTML tag. Inside the HTML tag, remember we have the head and the body sections? Notice that we've added something to the head section. In this case, we wanted to pull in our style sheet. Now, the style sheet isn't something that's displayed on the page. It's something that changes the configuration of the page. So the proper place to pull in the style sheet is in the head section. And the way that we do that is with a link tag. Link tags take two attributes. Before HTML5, there used to be 3, but now we only need 2, thank goodness. We have to have a rel attribute that will always be set to style sheet, because that's the kind of link we're including. So we're pulling in a style sheet link. And we also have an href attribute that is just like the href attribute for an A tag. This tells the web browser where to get the style sheet from. And so we just set it to some URL. In this case, if you just say boxes.css, it'll look for a file named boxes.css in the same folder that the HTML file came from. So that's the only change that we really need to make to the web page to pull in the style sheet is add this link tag. Over on the right side, we have a file named boxes.css, and it has rules for all the divs, and then for each div based on its ID. So we're going to style all the divs to have width that is 50% the width of the page. We're also going to center them. So we're going to center the text within the box, so it's right in the middle, from left to right. Then we're going to create 5 boxes. Box 1 is going to have a 2-pixel solid blue border, a margin of 10 pixels, and 40 pixels of padding. Box 2 will be similar, but it's going to have a thicker border, a 10-pixel border that will be green. We're also going to change the background color to be purple, and the color of the text to be white. Box 3 is also going to be similar. It's going to have a blue background, and we're going to give it a 2-dimensional margin. So the top and bottom margins will be 10 pixels. The left and right pixels will be 20. Left and right margins will be 20 pixels wide. Box 4, we're going to give only 10 pixels of padding, so you'll be able to see the difference between a box with lots of padding and a box with only a little padding. But we've given it a really big margin, a 100 pixel margin. And finally, box 5 is the same as box 1, except that, it's the same as box 3, except that we made a dash border instead of a solid border. And it's not going to be blue. So here's what that looks like. Again, box 1 has about 40 pixels of padding, and it has a 2-pixel solid blue border, 10-pixel margin. Hard to see the margin because it blends in with the margins of the other boxes, but it's there. Box 2 has a purple background. It has a much thicker border, a 10-pixel border that's solid green. Box 3 has a thin border, 2-pixel border again, but it has 10 pixels of margin on the top and bottom, and a much wider, a double-sized margin on left and right, 20 pixels on left and right. That's why it looks smaller than the box above it. Finally, box 4 has an enormous margin of 100 pixels all the way around, but it only has 40 pixels of padding. That's why it looks so skinny compared to the other boxes. And finally, box 5 has a dashboard. So we can actually take advantage of margins to do a kind of neat positioning trick. If you want to center an element on a page or within an element, within a container element, you can do what's called the margin auto trick. There's a special value, auto, that you can set a margin to that will position it so that the left and right margins are equal. Basically, it'll figure out how to center it for you. So in this case, if we set margin to 0 auto, we'll give it no top and bottom margin, but we'll set the left and right margin so that the element is centered in the page. That's not a great way to do positioning because it only lets us center things. A better way to do positioning is to use the position property, this position CSS property. The position property doesn't actually do anything on its own. What it does is it enables 4 other properties, left, right, top, and bottom, that allow you to specify the position of an element. Now, by default, top, bottom, left, and right don't do anything. And the reason for that is that the position property is set to static. Static positioning means that we allow the web browser to decide where things go. So elements are positioned according to the normal flow of the page. This is a pretty good default because typically the web browser does a pretty good job positioning things so that they fit, even if we resize the screen or display the page on a mobile device that has a tiny screen or on a much larger screen. So static positioning is a good default, but if we want more control, we can change the position property and grab that control. So one of the things that we can set the position property to is relative positioning. Relative positioning is similar to static positioning, but it allows us to change the position of an element by adding an offset. What that means is that I can, for instance, say, take the element and move it up 1 inch, or slide it to the left 2 centimeters. So other elements aren't affected by the shift. If I take a paragraph and I shift it to the left, it doesn't affect other paragraphs. This is a good thing because it means that they will still follow the natural flow, but it can be a bad thing because it means that now my shifted element might overlap with other elements. And it can actually cover them so I can't read what's behind it. Fortunately, there's another CSS property we can use to determine which elements are in front of other elements, and that property is the z-index. You can think of the z-index in terms of Cartesian coordinates. In your calculus class, if you graph a function, you probably use an x-axis and a y-axis. You can think of the z-index as a coordinate axis coming out of the screen. So the bigger the number, the further in front the element is. So if you have a z-index of 20, that element's going to be in front of most other elements. If you have a z-index of -4, and yes, you can have negative z-indices, that's going to be behind most of the other elements in the screen. So, for example, here I've said any element with ID box 2 should use relative positioning, and it should be shifted so that it is 10% of the width of the container from the left side of the screen. Right? So left tells me from the left side how much to shift it. So it's going to be shifted from the left side 10%. That means it's going to be shifted right. I know that's a little non-intuitive, but it's going to be shifted right by 10% of the width. And I've set the z-index to 20, so it's going to appear in front of most things. I think by default, elements have a z-index of 0, so any positive number will put it in front. An alternative to relative positioning is absolute positioning. Absolute positioning allows you to specify the exact position to place an element within the page. But absolute positioning positions elements within what's called the logical page. What do I mean by the logical page? If you have a really long document, it may not fit on your screen. And so the page doesn't show up on the screen all at once. You have to scroll to see the rest of it. And that means that the position on the screen is different than the position on the page. So when I position something on the logical page, I'm positioning it in the document, not on the screen. And so if I scroll, it may scroll off the top or scroll off the bottom. So if I use absolute positioning, I can say, for example, position an element 1/4 inch from the top and 1 inch from the right. So in this case, I'm applying that style, 1/4 inch from the top, 1 inch from the right, to any element with ID box 3. If I want to position something with respect to the screen rather than with respect to the logical page, I can do that. To do that, I use fixed positioning. So if I set the position to fixed and the right property to 2 inches, box 4 will be positioned 2 inches from the right on the screen. And that means that if I scroll, box 4 isn't going to move. It's going to stay right where it is. However, the text on the page might scroll behind it or in front of it. Again, I'm going to use the z-index to decide whether the text covers box 4 or whether box 4 covers the text. So here's what that looks like. In this case, box 1 and box 5 are positioned with static positioning. We let the web browser decide where they go, so they go in the normal place that they would ordinarily go on the page. Box 2 uses relative positioning. Remember, we set its positioning to be 10% to the left. 10% from the left. So it's shifted over to the right by 10% of the width of the page. We position box 3 with absolute positioning, and we put it 1/4 inch from the top and 1 inch from the right, so it's in the top right corner. And we position box 4 using fixed positioning at the bottom left corner of the screen. So This is considered a good way to position elements on the page, but it turns out that in practice what's done is to ignore the position property for the most part and instead use floating elements. Floating elements allow you to stack things in columns from left to right, so they make multi-column layouts very easy. And it's pretty easy to do this. All you have to do is set the float property to either left or right. And what will happen is that the web browser will take that element out of the normal flow of the page and shift it to the left as far as it can. And if you float multiple elements to the left, it'll put the first element all the way to the left, and then the next element you float left will slide over right next to it. So you can lay things out from left to right one at a time, or from right to left one at a time by floating them right. So here, in this example, suppose I have a nav bar with ID nav. I float it to the left. I also have some content in my document. I float that to the left so it'll appear next to the nav bar. I have a sidebar, maybe it's an advertising, and I'm going to float that to the right side of my document. That might look like this. Notice my nav bar is all the way on the left. I've got the content right next to it. Just for good measure, I threw some extra text in here so that you can see what happens. The text hasn't been floated either direction, so it's just being laid out by the web browser where the web browser thinks it fits best. And then I've got my sidebar, and it gets floated all the way over to the right. Now, one thing I want to point out is that order matters here. If I float two things to the left, the one furthest to the left will be the one that appears first in the web page. So the order of the tags in my document determines what order they stack from left to right. However, if I float something to the left, float something to the right, and then float something else to the left, as I've done here, the nav bar appears all the way to the left because it was the first thing floated left. The content pane appears next because it's been floated left. It's the next thing floated left. Even though the sidebar was between them, the content tag goes right next to the nav bar. The sidebar got floated to the right, so it's sort of in a different list, and it doesn't interfere with the things on the left. Now, if you read the text here, it says that this is a really long paragraph that really should start on the next line, but because there are floating elements, it is indented, which looks really ugly. And that's true. Often when you float things to the left or to the right, you'll cause text on your page to become indented. It'll wrap around the floating elements. And this might be what you want. Maybe you have a news article and you have some picture that you want text to wrap around. But often it's not what you want. Especially if you have like a header, like a title of a paragraph, and then you have a paragraph beneath it. You don't want the paragraph to start on the same line as the header. You want it to start on the next line. And you can fix this problem using the clear property. So the clear property allows you to tell an element that it needs to clear floating elements to the left or clear floating elements to the right. By clear, I mean it needs to get clear of. So if you, for example, take my paragraph, which I've given the ID description, and you tell it to clear left, it'll position the text so it's below any floating elements on the left side. You can set clear to be left, or right, or both, or none. If you set it to left, it'll be positioned below any elements floating on the left. If you set it to right, it'll be positioned below any elements that are floating on the right. If you set it to both, then it'll be positioned below any floating elements. And if you set it to none, it'll be laid out like you saw it originally. So if I tell it to clear the left, it'll look like this. Notice the text has been moved down below the navbar and content divs that I've placed here. And it's also below the sidebar box. That's kind of a coincidence. If the sidebar were longer, the text would actually wrap before it got to the sidebar, rather than clearing it. And the reason for that, the reason it worked out this way is that my sidebar and my content are the same height, and so moving the text below the content also moved it below the sidebar. So that's more or less what I want to show you about CSS layout. But before I go, I want to tell you about some other really useful CSS properties that you might find useful in your lab. We talked about how you can set the width and the height of an element, but you can also give the web browser a little bit more flexibility in how it lays things out by setting a minimum width or a maximum width instead of just a width. You can similarly set a minimum height or a maximum height. By the way, it's considered bad style to actually set a height for something because the web browser scrolls, and so it often needs to lay things out further down, and setting a fixed height can interfere with how it wraps things. You can also give an element a drop shadow by setting the box shadow property. So if you want something to look kind of cool, you can give it a little shadow behind it by setting box shadow. Basically what you do is you set the offset. You say like go 10 pixels over and 5 down, and it'll draw a shadow behind it. Similarly, you can make your text look fancy by using the text shadow or text outline properties. Text outline allows you to draw like block letters, which is kind of neat. There are also a few CSS selectors I didn't talk about last time that it's important for you to know. These are called pseudo-classes. And pseudo-classes are kind of tricky to talk about because they don't identify elements on the page. Instead, they identify particular aspects or states that an element can be in. So for example, the pseudo-class :hover can be combined with an A tag so that you can change the color of a link when someone moves the mouse over it. If they hover the mouse cursor over the link, these style rules will be applied. So in this case, I've said if they hover over any link in the page, change the color of the link to green. Similarly, you can set the color of a link when it's been visited. So if I've already clicked on a link and I go back to the page, I can keep track of the fact that I visited that page by marking it red. The before and after pseudo-classes are a little bit different. They actually apply styles to whatever comes before a tag. So in this case, I can say whatever comes before a paragraph, style in this manner. And whatever comes after a paragraph, style in this manner. Typically, these are used to inject HTML content into a page using the CSS. So maybe there's a tag you don't want to put in your HTML document, but you need it to be there to do some kind of CSS trick, some kind of hack. Well, you can do that with the content property. You can say, before every paragraph, insert this content. So for example, I can insert the word example : in bold before every paragraph with P : before. And similarly, I can insert a bunch of italicized @ signs. I don't know why I would want to do that, but I can with P : after. So these are important properties to know, important selectors to know. Feel free to use them in your lab. So in summary, the elements of the CSS box model are the content, which is inside padding, which is inside a border, which is inside a margin. We can position elements using static positioning, relative positioning, absolute positioning, or fixed positioning. We can also position elements using the float property. We can float them either to the left or to the right. That's good for multi-column layouts. And when we do that, we can use the clear property to ensure proper wrapping. I hope you're having fun in the class. I've sure enjoyed teaching you. Good luck on the first lab. You don't have a lot of time left on it, so be working on it now. And I will see you next time.